Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Best in Surrey. I'm Marisa Heath.
And I'm Paul Deach.
Hi, Paul. So today the big topic is the budget. I don't think we can avoid it, and I'd like to talk about what it means nationally and what it means locally and how it's going to impact our residents in Surrey. And I've got some really exciting news in that we're incredibly fortunate to have one of the world's leading tax lawyers on this podcast, Ashley Crosley. Ashley is
Right.
head of the wealth management department in a London office. He's been chair of many different groups. He's advised governments, he's advised high net worth families, and he's also a good friend, basically. I trust him wholly to give us some really good thoughts on what's going on with the budget this week. I think we've all got our own thoughts. And Paul, I'll start with you. You're not normally a money and finance guy. I know you
I'm
manage your
not.
budgets pretty well, but you're
Yeah.
so into this. But as a layperson, let's call it that. I'm a layperson too, compared to Ashley for sure. What do you think about this budget?
Well, I've been, as you know, I'm an avid listener of political podcasts. So what I decided I would do to lead into for when Ashley, starts answering our questions, I'm going to give you some quotes that I have taken the time to sort of write down from some of the podcasts that I've listened to, and it might be food for thought for us all when we go through the podcast. But one thing I would say though is that as Conservatives, we often, when we were in government, we would often hear our colleagues say, "Oh, the media, they're so biased, they're so always leaning towards the left or whatever." And I have to say that the coverage of this budget from various media outlets, I believe, has been really balanced. I have to say, particular Sky News. I'm an avid listener of Sky News, and I listen to some of their podcasts from some of their political presenters, and I found the coverage of this budget excellent. Now, one of the podcasts I listen to is Sam Coates from Sky News and Jack Blanchard of Politico. They run a podcast which is really, really good. I'd recommend it. Yeah, it's 20 minutes long every morning, and they talk about the leading stuff of the day. And obviously, their budget coverage was, quite extensive. So these are some of the quotes from Sam Coates from Sky News. He basically said the OBR is not a friend of Rachel Reeves. Short-term money is pouring into the NHS, but there are no questions over what happens in the medium term if this Parliament is in place and if it's enough. In the election campaign, Labour was saying they would only put substantial amounts of money into the public services if there is growth. That we're not going to tax, borrow and spend, and now tax, borrow and spend is exactly what they've done. And time and time again, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and others from Labour said, if you're going to put in big sums of money, then it's because you want to reform public services, and reform went hand in hand with the money. Well, at this budget, you've got the money, but what we don't have a sense of is what the reform plan is yet, and the cheque has already been written. So the question is, has the 20 billion over the next 2 years that has been put in and agreed, is that to fund day-to-day operations in the NHS as it seems to be, or will it be put aside in order to pay for what will be an expensive transition for services moving from hospitals and closer to local communities? That does not appear to be baked in. So that's what Sam Coates said.
I was going to say, did he actually also mention that, as he's come out today, that the national insurance increase is going to particularly hit GP surgeries and all the people being employed there? So at the very time when naturally you're going to have more and more pressure on the NHS, the national insurance rise, which, yes, they are protecting some in the health service by basically increasing their pay, because money's going round in a circle, on the very places where the pinch points are, which is in the GP services and care homes, they're going to be most adversely affected by the national insurance increase, as well as all the private sector. So I think I'm afraid when it comes to the NHS, they're actually going to hit the very front line that they said they were looking to protect.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Paul, I interrupted.
No, absolutely. And to answer your question, no, he didn't say that, but they do sort of squash it down into 20 minutes, or I suppose they were quite time constrained. But Jack Blanchard from Politico on the same podcast. I pulled out one quote from him, which basically said, Britain is becoming a health service with a state attached to it. But there is
Yeah.
no suggestion from the healthcare sector that what Rachel Reeves has done is somehow a magic bullet which will somehow solve the NHS crisis. And you do wonder where a budget like this is going to leave her in a couple of years. And I couldn't agree with that more.
The money's just going to disappear into the continuous black hole that is the NHS, I'm afraid. I'm very frank about this. I think it's an absolute waste at this point. Reform needed to come first. And Wes, whatever his name is, I can't remember it right.
Streeting,
Yeah,
Streeting.
promised us that. He said that NHS reform would come first before more money just got poured into it. Same as they promised us tax rises for working people wouldn't rise. Now, probably all three of us aren't considered working people under Labour's definition, from what I've gathered. I don't know who a working person is anymore because this budget impacts everyone from what I can see. Ash, you deal with high wealth clients, but do you agree that this isn't just a budget that's hurting them, it's a budget that's hurting everyone?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I've been very fortunate in my life, and yes, have become very successful. But I was a grammar school boy. I've had to work for everything I've ever achieved. So I would think I was a working person. I've had to get up very early in the morning at 5 a.m. and I've had to stay late at night, sometimes into the following morning on deals and things. So I think I work pretty hard. So I do question their idea about working people. But the idea that they haven't attacked working people, I mean, even Rachel Reeves yesterday actually started to admit that actually it will, because you know and everyone else knows that by increasing national insurance as they have done, that is going to get passed on through lower pay rises that people would get in the private sector. And it will also mean that they will otherwise try to find further cost savings. So I saw something very interesting yesterday that it said that if you were trying to give a person on maybe 35,000 a 3% pay increase, you're now likely only to give them about a 0.6% pay increase, because you've got to pay for all the extra national insurance is going to cost you because you're employing them. So it's pie in the sky that they're not going to be adversely affected. And another thing I thought was quite interesting was that the Resolution Foundation, which is not always a great friend of the Conservatives, also came out and said that actually the cost of living crisis under this budget is going to get worse.
Yes, that's massive.
And that they estimate that living standards will actually be as bad as in 1955.
Oh gosh. Well,
So, I mean, and that's from the Resolution Foundation. So I do think it's quite interesting when they say it won't affect working people. And I think working people will be the most affected because it's their jobs. So you'll probably find will not be increasing in any sort.
Yeah, and Paul, you pointed out even the Guardian wasn't speaking very joyously about this budget.
no, they're not at all. And I just want to come to the final podcast that I listened to and actually interview by Beth Rigby. Now, Beth Rigby of Sky News interviewed the Chancellor yesterday. And I have to say that that interview was uncomfortable to watch. So I can't imagine how it must have been for the Chancellor herself. You could visibly see her squirming in her seat. Beth Rigby was absolutely brutal. And I'm just going to pull out two things that Beth Rigby said, and then we can go into the questions that we have for you, Ashley. But the first one, she said, Chancellor, even if you accept the 22 billion black hole, 8 billion of that is because you decided to settle public sector pay disputes. Are you telling me that before the general election, you did not have an inkling that you would have to find billions of pounds to settle public sector pay disputes? And why did you not level with the British public about that? And she also said, Wes Streeting repeatedly told me before the general election, when I kept saying to him the NHS is going to need more funding, he kept saying funding is not the answer. We are going to get it through growth. You have just announced 22.6 billion in extra day-to-day spending for the NHS. You were just not straight with the British people, and they will see straight through this. So really brutal, I think, on the Chancellor, and I think they've been found out very quickly.
Yeah, and to be honest, pretty brutal on the British people.
Yeah,
because they're the ones having to fund it. This is the problem, I think, with politics at the moment, is people, whether it be better, they see this as some problem that the politicians had, but it's the politicians that are making the decisions that will affect people when actually they can't afford to take on extra people. So the growth is not going to happen. I mean, this budget is not a budget for growth at all. It's a budget actually of managed decline. And I think that that is a serious concern, I think, for a lot of both private sector businesses, but even areas where we really do need the funding, which is in the NHS, and understands we need to have reform. But to actually increase both the minimum wage and national insurance on GP surgeries and care homes, when exactly those were the pinch points for many people, seems to be very short-sighted in their policy decision making.
Do you think, I mean, the reactions of the markets are saying something, aren't they, Ash? I mean, I kind of posed the question, is Rachel Reeves the new Liz Truss? We've seen the borrowing costs have soared, value of the pound's fallen, traders are dumping UK assets. There isn't even growth in this. At least Liz Truss was aiming to try and find some growth, wasn't she? I mean, what does this really mean for the UK? Is this disastrous in your view?
I think two things. I think, first of all, to deal with the Liz Truss point, I think the idea of trying to reduce taxes and regulation is a good thing. I mean, I'm a strong Thatcherite. Let's be honest about it. That's my position. So do I think that the ideas were, in the right direction? Yes. Do I think it was badly handled? And did they spend money they hadn't got? Yes. And that, I think, is then the similarity to this budget.
Okay.
Because actually what is happening is they are spending far too much money, which they haven't got. And that they've done that by changing the investment criteria. I mean, Rachel Reeves mentioned this at the dispatch box. And that, I think, is what has spooked the markets, to go to your question, Marisa, because the markets can see that actually this government is spending huge amounts of money. It is likely it's going to have to raise taxes. In fact, it was raised yesterday that it is likely they're going to have to raise taxes again to try and pay for this expenditure. And there is very little room. We were already one of the highest taxed in our lifetimes in our history.
Yeah.
We're now going to be even more so, what the increases we've had so far. So I think it is a very bad budget, and really when we should have been keeping taxes low, reforming the public services, and looking to continue what Jeremy Hunt had been doing, looking like reducing national insurance, which is a tax on working people. Even he said that when he reduced it. Instead of that, we've gone in completely opposite direction. And I think that is not only bad for the UK, but it's very bad for a signal about whether the UK is open for business to the international investor community.
Yeah, I think that's a question we'll get to in a minute. We'll go back to the questions that Paul and I wanted to ask you. Paul, shall I start, or do you want
Yeah,
to?
you go ahead. You start. Yeah.
So I remember we spoke to each other during the general election campaign, and you were seeing a lot of your clients making decisions on what to do. So they didn't even know it was going to be a Labour government, but the polls were indicating it. No one knew this massive majority were coming, but obviously people were already thinking, shall I get out of the UK? Which is a pretty worrying thought to me. What has happened since Labour got in, and what's happened since this budget? I mean, what's your week been like since Wednesday? What are your clients doing and thinking?
Well, I should make clear I'm talking in a personal capacity, but certainly in terms of my experience, the clients that I deal with, many of them were already considering leaving the UK or thinking of other jurisdictions, because in my world, you see the UK as part of a competitive international environment. It's not just an island on itself where nothing else happens outside it. We are competing in the world for the entrepreneurs. We're competing for the business owners, the business and wealth creators. And the problem is that this budget doesn't help. It doesn't help because obviously it changed things like the non-dom regime and replaced it with a new 4-year residence regime, which has several issues and problems with it. But it also changed the rules in such a way that people that were non-dom that were leaving are actually caught under rules that won't even come into effect until next year, which is sort of retrospective taxation. And so that makes the UK look quite unstable, because it means people think, hang on a minute, I can not only be taxed on the laws that I know are existing now, but I can get taxed on laws that will be brought in next year.
That's big. Yeah, that is a big issue.
That has a fundamental impact, I think, on confidence. So I think, unfortunately, the exodus that you were starting to see of non-doms, that was going to happen anyway, because Labour was quite clear that they wanted to do that, and the Conservatives had announced that they were going to do it. That has increased and will increase now that the budget has happened.
Okay. So in your experience, because you're at the sort of front line of these business people, you've just used that word. Before I get to my question, by the way, you've just used that word exodus. Give us a sense in your personal experience in this space, what that exodus looks like. I mean, is it really an exodus?
Yes, I mean, in my career, I've been doing this probably for about 30 years, so for quite a long time. I spent most of my professional life advising people on coming to the UK, either themselves or bringing investment into the UK. It's been that direction, and all of my time since all of this started in the summer has gone the other way.
Wow.
Okay,
And that's everything. That's not just occasional. And that's why when I say exodus, it means, and I'm sure this is what it's in the media, it's been repeated across many professionals across London and across the UK, where actually you're no longer looking for inward investment, you're trying to stem people leaving. And that is not a good position for the UK to be in.
Not at all.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I'll get to my question now, which is, what does this budget mean for our residents in Surrey? So not the super wealthy. We know we've got a lot of mega affluence in Surrey. There's also quite a lot of deprivation, but I'm talking about the people in between. Not the super wealthy, but those who have some assets and capital and are doing okay. What does it mean to them?
So if we deal first of all with the people who are working, and obviously you've got the employer national insurance. We've discussed that already earlier in the podcast, and that will affect them because ultimately they may not get the pay rises they would hope to, or they may have to be paying added national insurance. Also on the capital gains tax, there's been a lot of talk, as you know, about farmers and agricultural property relief. Yeah. Remember, this also applies to business property relief.
Yes.
So for family businesses that are looking to pass the family business down to the generations, this is just as much an issue as it is for the farmers. The farmers are probably even worse affected because, of course, the land isn't necessarily such an easy asset to sell. And the idea of having to do that is going to be a problem for them, I think. And it could mean quite an issue in terms of the rural communities. But also for family businesses, it's just as bad because the restriction on $1 million still applies to them as well. And they're going to now have to fund and find basically increase profits in their businesses to fund the fact that the family will be able to pass down generations. So I do think it will have quite an impact for the sort of family businesses in Surrey. I think one of the other issues is obviously if you're buying a house, your first time buyers in Surrey, I'm sure will be very upset because whereas up until Rachel Reeves was dealing with it, they were, you know, the first about 400,000 odd would have been all right, but it's going to fall back to 300,000. So what's going to happen now is a first-time buyer buying a £400,000 house after 31st of March next year is going to pay another £5,000 stamp duty.
It just goes against everything Labour have been talking about. They wanted homes for first-time buyers. The hypocrisy in this is just mind-boggling.
They talked about housing policy and how they wanted to help people onto the housing ladder. And the first thing they've done in their budget is hit first-time buyers such that they're going to have a £5,000 extra bill. And frankly, in our area, in Surrey, you know, 400,000, you know, that's not out of reach for most people trying to get on the housing ladder. So I'm afraid that's pretty bad for them. For everybody else, just as a little tip, if you are buying a house, I would try to do it before the 31st of March, because obviously for everybody else as well, that threshold is coming down from 250,000 to 125, which will make about a £2,000 difference. So, you know, for people necessarily buying houses, buy it now. And obviously for anyone who is fortunate enough to be thinking about a second home, of course, you've now got your 5% surcharge that will apply. And remember that applies across all the levels, not just... so I'm afraid on buying houses is not good. On capital gains tax, you've had the rise. You've got from 10 to 18% for basic rate, not just attacking higher rate people, basic rate taxpayers going from 10 to 18. And this will mean that lots of people who are, as you say, got a few assets, maybe invested in some shares, they're going to have higher rates because remember the capital gains tax allowance was cut and cut under actually the last administration. So you've had the double whammy of cutting the capital gains tax allowance to virtually not much at all now, and now increasing by 8% CGT for basic rate taxpayers. That's going to hit ordinary working people with a few savings, far more than is being described, I think, in the headlines at the moment. So those are a few points, and obviously
the basic message from that is if you've saved and worked hard, you'll be punished. If you're a farmer trying to grow food for this country, you'll be punished. I mean, the result of that is farmers' families may have to sell parcels of land. And at the moment, farming isn't looking like that much of a fun business to be in anyway. So things like solar farms, housing on farms, eating into our rural land is a real jeopardy, I think, from this. It just seems so backwards to then saying we care about the environment, we want to have food security, we want to help people be independent into their old age and things. All of it just doesn't measure up to me. It's incredibly worrying. Just going back to
also on environmental schemes, which are the point I know close to your heart, Marisa.
yes,
The government has, I think, confirmed today, because it's being pushed, would its changes in APR also affect environmental schemes. But it is relevant because obviously if farmers are now trying to maximise the value of their land, the sort of set aside for environmental things going to be far more difficult from a business perspective to do when they're trying to save up for the IHT that they're now going to have to pay. So I think it will probably affect the ability of which farmers are prepared to go into environmental schemes.
Yeah, no, I agree. Incredibly worrying. I'm just circling back to the non-dom issue. I mean, it sounds really obvious, but just to just to clarify this, the issue is it's not as the socialist perspective is that goodbye wealthy people. If you don't want to buy tax, sod off, basically, it doesn't matter. This is about wealth creation within the country, about creating jobs, about creating opportunities for every British person as well. That's going to have an impact, isn't it, on the general sort of standing of this country and all of the opportunities for our young people too. I mean, you want people with money here setting up AI companies or tech companies or innovating, and they're going to go to other countries now, aren't they? What sort of other countries do these people go to? Who's offering a better deal in the UK?
Well, actually, quite a few in the European Union,
Oh, okay.
which always makes me laugh. That we get Brexit, we leave the European Union, and then the first thing we're now doing is making the UK more uncompetitive than many of our European colleagues. So, I mean, this was not how Brexit should be going. But putting even that to one side, and whether you're competing with the Netherlands or France or Spain, which has its own particular options, Italy, as you know, has brought in effectively a reasonably good, attractive thing to attract wealthy people to Italy. And if you look at that in other jurisdictions, you've obviously got the States to a certain extent, you've got Dubai and other jurisdictions, but the European jurisdictions are doing enough. I mean, the idea that somehow the non-dom concessions were completely different to anything else in the world, it was rubbish. Lots of jurisdictions have ways of trying to attract wealthy people to spend money in the UK. And remember, what the Conservative government did was they actually were charging, 50,000, 30,000, 50,000, went to £90,000 a year to take advantage of that regime, whereas the new regime is going to be 4 years tax-free. You don't have to pay anything. So it's a really weird way. What I had proposed to the previous Conservative government, which unfortunately they didn't adopt, would have been a global Britain visa, which would have given people a rolling 5-year period. It was a bit like a Swiss structure where people pay effectively to get a tax advantage. And then every 5 years, the HMRC government decides, has that person contributed enough through either employment or through things to make it worthwhile saying, yeah, we'll do you another agreement for 5 years. So keep that.
Idea. Yeah. Great idea.
I know, we've decided not to do that. We've decided to scare off a whole load of wealthy people so they don't spend any money here. And by the way, offer a 4-year deal, which doesn't require any sort of payment or commitment to the UK whatsoever. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy.
Right. Okay. Well, still on non-doms, do you think if the Tories get back in, and then, I know some might think it's wishful thinking that the Tories might get a bit back in the next election. But if they did, do you think that what's happened now is so irreparable that we'll never get them back?
I think the UK has lost quite a lot of its international reputation for stability. And I'm afraid that's going to take some time. I mean, I was talking to a person in the UAE who had very strong links to the UK, and she was saying when her parents ever talked about Britain, they always said, whatever decision the British government makes, don't worry, it'll be the right one. They know what they're doing. That has gone. That has gone. And it's going to take time for us to repair our international standing. But the answer to that is to make sure that if and when the Conservatives do get back in, and certainly how the Conservatives behave in opposition, we show very clear, stable, good, well thought through policies that will make the UK attractive to business and entrepreneurs, both in terms of attracting in foreign investment, but also to our own homegrown entrepreneurs. And that requires us to, I think, become far more mature in how we actually deal with a lot of these issues and realize it's not about sound bites, it's about proper thought out policies that are really carefully worked through and then explained.
Thank you.
Yeah. Going back to inheritance tax, Ash, Surrey's a place where people bought houses in the sort of 80s and things for £50,000 or whatever, and now they're now worth 1.2 million, 2 million, 3 million, whatever. These are people that potentially don't have much cash, but they've got this asset. How damaging is the new inheritance tax going to be to them? I mean, what are we looking at here? Is this something Surrey residents should be starting to come up with plans around now as to how they maybe move assets on to children and that kind of thing? Is there still opportunities to do that?
Yeah. So in terms of inheritance tax, what's been happening, as you know, is that they have they've said that they're going to freeze the threshold till 2030.
Okay.
So effectively, the nil rate band is going to be frozen until 2030, which means that even more and more people are going to be brought within the inheritance tax net. What it also means is that because the pensions are now going to be brought within the inheritance tax net, that's going to take a lot more people into inheritance tax than I think at the moment think they would be. Because, for example, I was doing there was an example being given of somebody with like 50,000 of savings, a house worth 400,000, and a defined pension pot of 100 grand after they died. Now, at the moment, they'd pay no tax on that because they have the various nil rate bands and reliefs. After these changes, they'll pay at least 20,000 in tax. Now, to be honest, I think for many Surrey residents, £400,000 house with 100,000 maybe in your pension and 50 grand, these aren't super rich people.
Yeah.
But they're straight away going to be brought into the inheritance tax net, not just because of their house, but actually because of their pension when they've been put away. So for a lot of people, this is going to be really quite devastating, and they're going to have to pay a lot more in tax than they thought they were. And remember, inheritance tax is also a charge often on earned income as well. We talk about the house, but also most of this money has had tax paid on it before. It's not just money that's been sort of in houses, and those people are 40% on tax they've already paid 45% or 40% on already.
God. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll come back in a moment to talking about what we could do as opposition to kind of counteract all of this. But I read something, and I'm not by any means an expert on this, but I read an article that was saying that Rachel Reeves was creating a kind of Ponzi scheme out of UK assets. So, for example, she was talking about taking the student loans as a full figure and using as an asset to borrow against when you don't actually know if it's going to be repaid in full. There's lots of parts of student loans that don't get repaid. So this kind of Ponzi scheme is built up over money that doesn't really exist, and then it's got the opportunity to just collapse. Do you foresee, and I know you haven't got a crystal ball, but do you see something as disastrous as the UK economy literally bursting over the next 5 years, or do you think we've got enough to carry on getting through this Labour government?
I think we've got enough. I mean, I think that's a question really for the markets. Rather than for a tax lawyer. But the markets have already shown nervousness. I think you will find the nervousness is because of the very point you make, Marisa, which is they're spending money they haven't got. Yes, they're raising money, but they've changed the investment criteria to give themselves about 140 billion to spend, which they haven't got. And I think that where it will go wrong, as it went wrong for Liz Truss, is if the markets at any point think, actually, the game's up, guys. And that could happen. That could happen. I sort of take the view, probably not, because I think ultimately they will be forced to have to curtail some of their spending, because I think that ultimately you will find, I think as elections happen, that the Conservative Party does start to do better, because I think this budget has already been very badly received. And I think that may curtail it.
But the issue is they've already given money to the public sector. They've bowed down to pay rises immediately, and there will be other people coming forward now asking for pay rises as well. But how they're going to manage this is going to be incredibly difficult for them. It's going to put them in a very, very tricky position, I think.
Yes, I agree. As I say, and also I don't think several of the policies have been worked through. The non-dom policy has not been thought through properly. Clearly, the national insurance policy, when it's affecting GPs and care homes, has not been thought through properly. The business property relief and agricultural property relief, as you're seeing already from farmers and also family business owners, that's not been thought through properly. And
Well,
I think
look at
that's
the VAT on schools. That they've all shown that numbers don't stack up there either.
I mean, the VAT on schools, I think, was one of the worst elements, just from a purely human perspective. To bring it in on the 1st of January, partway through a school year, I think is quite disgraceful, really. And I do think really was something that, again, hasn't been thought through. I mean, the only thing on the VAT in schools and the business rates is that, obviously, as you know, several of the schools are now, they're going to bring a legal action, which was announced, I think, earlier today, was it, or yesterday. We'll see how Lord Panic does on that. He's a good lawyer, using the European Court of Human Rights, by the way. So we will see whether we pull out or not in time. But the key point on the VAT is that it will enable them, to a certain extent, to reclaim some of the VAT that is paid. So it's an absolutely dreadful policy. But again, I think the numbers don't add up. And I think you will find a lot of schools will start to make reclaims, which they can do for back capital payments up to 10 years ago. So there is quite an amount, I'm sure, that they can try to claim back.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So a lot of I mentioned the media at the beginning of this podcast, and a lot of the media are saying that Rachel Reeves is taking a massive gamble with some of these budget decisions. Is Rachel Reeves the new Liz Truss? Or should we be saying that Starmer is? Because at the end of the day, it'll have been him that signed it all off.
Yeah. So I think I've given you my view on the Liz Truss budget. I think I think a lot of people believed that when Keir Starmer won the election, he was sort of going to be a bit of the heir to Blair, where initially he wouldn't do too much to frighten the horses because he wanted to be. This was a very left-wing budget. Okay. Was not a middle of the road budget. This has been back to the worst sort of tax and spend budget you could have had, of hitting the private sector absolutely as hard as they can to fund effectively politicians making decisions as to what they want to spend your money on. So I'm afraid I wouldn't really think of it in Liz Truss, because I would say her heart was in the right place. It's just they didn't implement all. I question whether the heart is in the right place on this budget, because I think it's a budget which says politicians know better than the ordinary person in the street managing their business. And I think fundamentally that's the wrong way for a government to consider how it should operate the country. I think it should be letting private enterprise and private people decide how to spend their money, not politicians.
Yeah, same. I mean, I feel punished by this budget as a small business owner. And there was a guy on Sky News, wasn't there, crying, a small business owner yesterday. They interviewed him and he was so upset by it. So, yeah, I think it is a very different budget to the Liz Truss one, much as that caused its own problems. Right, so final two questions before we wrap up, Ash. What do you think? You've already given us an idea, because you just mentioned a really good policy the Conservatives can take on. But what do you think the Conservatives should be thinking about now to counteract this budget? How's the new leader appointed tomorrow going to come out of the starting blocks on?
Well, I think firstly, the new leader needs to be holding the government to account very strongly on its economic and tax policies. And that requires really a real upskilling on these issues right from the get-go. We have no time to lose, because we need this to be, in my view, a four-term, a one-term Labour government. If this is what they want to do, it needs to be a one-term one. what I would suggest is, firstly, in terms of things like VAT on schools, I think you can really point to the fact that actually, again, there's several broken promises here, because most of the children with special educational needs, military families, they're not actually being taken outside this VAT charge. They're actually going to be in the VAT charge. It's just they're going to try and compensate them some other way. And I think the same thing on the GP. How on earth can this government say it's going to prioritise healthcare when it's actually going to attack care homes and GPs on the health service? So I think there are various things we can do on that. On tax policy specifically, I would do several things. Firstly, I wouldn't have increased national insurance because that's a tax on jobs. I do think there was some scope on capital gains tax to think about equalisation measures. So I don't necessarily disagree with the carried interest changes. I think there were certain things that the government did that they should do, because there was a lot of people moving income into capital gain as a way of trying to play the system. So I do think there were some things there. On stamp duty, I would have gone the other way. James cleverly, as you know, wanted to abolish it. I wouldn't have abolished it, but I certainly wouldn't have hit first-time buyers, and I certainly wouldn't have hit people, you know, when we're trying to get the housing market moving again, because it's basically stagnated. I certainly wouldn't, and I would certainly oppose the agricultural property relief and business property relief changes. I would have extended effectively those capital gains tax relief for entrepreneurs, whereas they've restricted it. So the short answer is there's a whole range of things I would have done differently, probably the opposite of what they did on each of these cases. But the key point is, how was that going to get paid for? Some of it would have been through carried interest taxation, and I think the rest would have had to come through proper management of the public finances, which is making sure you don't spend money you haven't got.
Yeah.
I think is a good
We're continuing to grow the public sector. Growth hasn't been factored into this budget. We know growth is the answer. So those entrepreneurs, those people starting businesses, allowing small businesses to grow and employ people, all of those sorts of things have been missing, and they're pretty basic. I'm no economist or anything, but even I know that. So I think that the final question I'd just ask is, what is one tip? And this is quite a tricky one, Ash. What is one tip you'd say to Surrey families? Is it as simple as hold tight and just get through the next 4 years, or is there something they can do to protect themselves? Should they do something? I mean, you've already said buy your property before April next year.
Yeah, buy your property before April next year. I think another thing is the potential exempt transfer regime was not abolished. There'd been a lot of press speculation it wasn't. So that enables you to give assets to your children.
Yes.
So I would definitely think, as long as you survive the 7 years, and that is something I know certainly people, family businesses and people who would have benefited but now won't from their agricultural property relief, I do think that is one thing you could start to think about, is making potential exempt transfers. Because I think that's one easy way of bringing a whole load of this stuff outside the tax changes that they'll be bringing in. So I think that's certainly something they should be thinking about.
And has the child got to be over the age of 18? Is that a rule, or can they be
No.
young?
You can give gifts to children of any age, provided, of course. I mean, what you're thinking about is that if they get the income, that income can be deemed that of the parent below an age. But what we're talking about is both either agricultural business property, where you think actually let's try and give it away now before the change come in, on the basis that they survive 7 years. Because if they survive 7 years, there's no tax. Actually, there's a taper after 3 years, so you're still better off. The only point on that, just to make it, is be careful of what they call the gift with reservation of benefit rules. Very tax loyally, but effectively you need to be careful that if you give it away, you have to give it away. You can't give it away on using it and living in it or whatever.
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah, okay.
Careful on that. The only other thing to do is just maximize out on your ISAs and things, because obviously they're still outside the capital gains tax hikes. So yeah.
Wow.
That's great.
Wow, Ashley, what an incredible insight. Thank you so much for that.
No problem.
Yeah, we're going to share this far and wide. I'm sure a lot of people will benefit from some of the advice that you've given there. Really fantastic, and thank you for joining us.
No problem.
No, hugely appreciated. I think we're going to move on to our Surrey discovery, so you're welcome to listen in on that or whatever you like, Ash. This is going to be over to Paul now because I'm conscious I've been talking a lot. I know I get so excited about tax, but here I am at this age. I guess you have to.
Well, I thought this week I would do a Surrey discovery based on the fact that after all this budget and announcements, and people are going to be thinking, "Gosh, I need to not spend as much money," um, on some of the free things that we can do in this county. So the one that immediately came to mind to me is Surrey Libraries, right? We've got some phenomenal libraries in Surrey, and I don't care what anyone says. These are not boring places. They're really vibrant, modern spaces. I don't know if you've ever been to the Woking Library. That was one that was recently updated, as was the one in where you were campaigning.
Poorly.
Hawley, that
Yeah,
was it,
yeah.
Hawley, which has become a super access library.
Mm.
But they also have some phenomenal free events in there, especially for children, because we want to encourage children to read and all the rest of it. And I just think that libraries are such magical spaces. And there's just so much to do there. I discovered reading later on in life. I have to say, it wasn't something that interested me when I was young, but I love reading now. And right now I'm reading Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, which is a phenomenal book, and was the book that Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote the play Hamilton. Another thing I would recommend you go and see in London at the London Victoria Theatre.
Yeah.
That was the book that he read and that inspired him to write the show.
Oh, wow.
And it is fantastic. And what a man that Alexander Hamilton, what an incredible guy he was. But that's another story. So Surrey Libraries, the best place to go to if you want to get the kids interested and engaged, completely free of charge. And look on the Surrey Libraries website, because the chances are there's going to be a free event
Yeah.
available.
That's a good one, Paul. I didn't think of that, but you're right, because libraries aren't like what they imagine of people just sitting silently. There's quite a lot going on in our libraries, and I think you can get like films and all
Ebooks,
sorts of ebooks
audiobooks.
and
You
yeah.
don't actually even have to go into the library. You can download the Surrey Libraries app and download free audiobooks
Oh
onto
wow.
onto
Oh,
your device. Yeah, fantastic.
okay. Right, no, that's a good shout. I'll keep mine really short and simple this time. If you haven't got much money, but you can scrape together the money to pay for the parking, head up to Box Hill this
Oh
weekend.
yes.
You're never going to get a better walk than that. You might be able to scrape the pennies together after Reeve's budget to buy yourself a coffee.
Yeah.
And they do both normal sausage rolls and vegan sausage rolls, and they're both bloody good.
I
So
know you bought me a vegan sausage roll up there during your campaign, and I can confirm they are absolutely amazing. So yeah, Box Hill, great shout.
yeah. Okay, so that's it for another episode. We'll be back next week and we've got another brilliant guest. In fact, the next couple of podcasts, we've got two excellent guests lined up. So it's looking exciting and I'll wish you a good week in the meanwhile, Paul.
And you, goodbye.